Afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dubrovnik. The weather is beautiful, as you see here, so we can expect a wonderful swimming break on the beach between the talks. You wish, I guess. I wish as well. I'm actually in Budapest. My name is Gergely Csibra. I am the head of the society that organizes this conference every year. The society was established and the conference series was launched 12 years ago by Csaba Play, who's here with us today, I hope. At least he will attend the conference. If you want to chat with him, you can have a chat with him. This conference is unique, not just because of this magical location of Dubrovnik, but also because how it's organized. Every year, a different topic is chosen within the broad field of cognitive science, and different program chairs are appointed. And while we have a devoted group of people who always attend, the majority of the audience tends to change from year to year. Last year, we had to cancel UCOG, and this year we will try this online version. I hope it will work well. So far, it works well. But we will miss the swimming breaks, the seafood, and the historical atmosphere of Dubrovnik. This format allowed us to include more speakers than usual and a larger audience. The chairs of the conference this year will be Rachel Dudley and Isabel Dautriche. They are the ones who put together the program for the next 4 days. Rachel will now introduce the theme of the program and explains the logistics of the sessions. Enjoy the conference.
So thank you. We put together the program for 2021 around the theme Linguistic and Cognitive Foundations of Meaning. And before I introduce the theme, I just want to take a second to acknowledge my co-chair, Isabel Dautriche, who put the program together with me, obviously. She had a family emergency and unfortunately she won't be able to join us. She would have done anything within her power to be here today to introduce the first two speakers. So she sends her regrets, but I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge her. And so for the theme, of course, one of the central questions in cognitive science revolves around the relationship between language and cognition more broadly. And for Isabel and I, studies in the domain of meaning provide a really important window onto this relationship. So of course, language helps us to externalize meanings, but does it allow us to do so in virtue of linking up with concepts that are already in place before language even comes into the picture, so to speak? Or is it actually that language influences the kinds of concepts that we have? And so Isabel and I put together this program to get different interdisciplinary perspectives on these questions from linguists, psychologists, and philosophers. We have a really interesting range of contributions over the next 4 days, from theoretical ones to empirical ones, and comparisons of different languages, different ages, populations, even different species. So I hope that you guys are looking forward to the rest of the conference as much as we are. I just want to go over a few practicalities before we start the first session. So we have 2 streams of presentations in the conference. The first I have highlighted here in yellow is the live stream, and you can think of this as the session where all of the conference participants are coming together in one virtual space. And so each day we have a pair of these live sessions, and we will use the same Zoom room all day. So there's a Zoom room for Tuesday, one for Wednesday, so on and so forth. And as you can already see, those links are posted in the Slack about 15 minutes before the start of the first session. So these sessions are all organized with multiple speakers. And after each talk, time permitting, we'll have a short period for questions, but there will be a much longer discussion period at the end of the session. So stick around for that. Of course, these times are limited, and so we won't be able to cover all of the discussion that we have. So we encourage you to continue that conversation and that discussion afterwards in the Slack channel. You can find a dedicated channel for each one of these live presentations for to continue the discussion with the presenter or any of the other attendees. So the second stream of presentations is the one I have highlighted here in blue. And these are asynchronous presentations. So these serve as a chance to meet and speak to presenters in smaller settings between the live talks that we have every day. So you can think of these as sort of online poster session where Slack is the big virtual conference hall where those posters are located. Each presentation has its own channel in Slack, and you can find all the materials that the presenters have preloaded. So this could be anything from posters, preprints, slides, even videos. And of course, you can start the discussion with those presenters anytime, but note that they each have a scheduled session where they'll be asked to be present live to participate in discussion. And so those sessions are separated over the 4 days. Each day has about 20 to 30 presentations specific to that. So I encourage you to look up in the program and see what you're interested in. And one big tip for Slack, if you're interested in a presentation, make sure you click the join button in the channel for that presentation. And that way you'll be updated about any further discussion that happens with respect to that presentation after you leave. So now we can turn to the first session of the conference. And we'll keep these introductions short since we have not very much time, but I just wanted to say a little bit about why we brought these two speakers together. So for this first session, we have the pleasure of welcoming Jennifer Culbertson and Emmanuel Shamla. Both Jennifer and Emmanuel have developed lines of research. Let me navigate so you can see what I'm talking about. Both Jennifer and Emmanuel have developed lines of research that investigate how key syntactic and semantic features of language are shaped by properties of the human cognitive system. And they're both using experimental methods with human children, human adults, and animals. And so for the first speaker, I'd like to turn things over to Jennifer Culbertson, who is the director of the Center for Language Evolution at the University of Edinburgh. And let me just stop my screen share so she can start hers, and let's welcome her.
Hi, thanks very much. I'll just share my screen. Oops. Oh, sorry, hold on just a second. All right, give me a thumbs up if that's looking good for you.
We're not on the title slide, but we can see it.
Okay, sorry about that. Okay, great. So thanks very much for having me. I'm really pleased to be here and to be starting off what looks like such a wonderful conference. I'm heartbroken not to be in Dubrovnik, especially now that I heard there would have been swimming breaks. That's killing me. But in any case, here I am in sunny Edinburgh, and I'm looking forward to telling you a bit more about my research and hearing what you all have to say about it. Right, so I'll kick it off. My work is generally interested in a kind of big challenge in cognitive science, which is trying to understand why languages look the way they do. Now, of course, this is a really complicated question, and we know there are many forces that shape why languages look the way they do. For example, sort of general features of our cognitive system, like learning mechanisms, memory limitations. We know these things shape language. It's also possible that specific features about the way we represent language shape why languages look the way they do. Things like how we perceive linguistic features, how we, how some of them might be more salient than others, the degree to which we're sensitive to structure-based rules. All these kinds of things are kind of more about the way we represent language in particular. And of course, on top of that, there are external factors like the history of languages, geographic relationships that languages have to one another. So all these kinds of things go into shaping what we call linguistic typology. Now, it happens to be that in the history of the field, a lot of evidence for particular factors shaping linguistic patterns tends to be sort of sparse and indirect. And that's partly because for a long time in linguistics, the main source of evidence has been typology. So we look across the languages we know or that we study, and we sort of take a count and see how many languages look like this and how many languages look like that. And that tends to be kind of sparse data. It's also indirect data in the sense that it doesn't necessarily tell us which kinds of these features are relevant. So we need to do more work in order to actually figure that out. And maybe as a result of this, there's been lots of disagreement in the history of linguistics and cognitive science about why languages look the way they do. So the kind of work that I've been doing is trying to build sort of better explanatory theories that are based on new sources of evidence for particular linguistic phenomenon. So still focusing on the understanding of why languages look the way they do, but what we really need are a kind of combination of theories that make testable predictions, typological data, and some corroborating evidence beyond that. For example, from behavioral experiments, from corpora, from models. So I'm going to give you a kind of sense for the sort of work that I've been doing, trying to build these kinds of better explanations based on richer sets of evidence in 3 domains. And going along with the theme of the conference, I'm going to be giving you evidence for one particular sort of factor in shaping why languages look the way they do, namely the role of representations of meaning. So first I'll talk about this in person systems. And here, person systems is an area where you think, yes, of course, representations of meaning are important. But here I'm going to be focused on like, what are those representations in particular? The second thing I'll talk to you about is nominal modifier ordering. So this is more a syntax where maybe you might have thought meaning was important, but I'll actually argue that it's very critical in several respects. And then the third is morpheme ordering. So I'll take you through each one of those in turn. And what I'll be doing is kind of highlighting the key aspects of theories that we can test based on typological evidence, but also evidence from experimental methods like artificial language learning and silent gesture experiments, and also some evidence from cross-linguistic corpora. Okay, so jumping right into person systems. Right, so I'll first give you a sense for the person space. So the person space categorizes entities as a function of their role in a discourse context. So we have the speaker or signer, we have the addressee, and we have others who don't play a direct role in the conversation. And languages typically lexicalize these person categories using things like personal pronouns. So for example, in English, I, you, they, etc. If we look at cross-linguistic evidence, it actually suggests that these are not the only person categories we have. So in particular, there's a 4th category that includes both the speaker, signer, or the addressee. That's sometimes called the first person inclusive. And it might look like a number distinction, but it's not actually, it's a person category. It can be distinguished from the so-called exclusive, first exclusive, which is the speaker and others, not including the addressee. And then if we want to make the plural form of that, that's going to include, the plural form of the inclusive, that's going to include the speaker, the addressee, and others. Okay, so that's the person space. So if we assume, and this is somewhat of a simplification, that we've got an 8-cell space, so where we're dealing with 4 person categories, and of course they interact with number. So here I'm just using a simplified notion of number. So if we just take this 8-cell space, the question immediately arises, how is this space lexicalized in languages? That is, how do languages partition this space? So there are some languages that have a unique form for each meaning, like Ilocano, for example. So 8 meanings, 8 pronouns. There are other languages, like English, for example, that feature what we call homophony. So you've got 8 meanings, but only 5 pronouns. So for example, English doesn't distinguish the inclusive and exclusive first person. And we also have homophony between first person singular and first person plural. So those are just 2 examples, but we can ask, okay, well, what do languages generally do? And even though there are actually lots and lots of possible ways to partition this space, only a small minority of those are tested. So I'm showing you a visualization of that here. The details aren't important, but that is nowhere near 4,000 different partitions. So we've got some interesting potential constraints on the way these partitions work. Now, there are a number of really interesting theories of the person space, and they have the general goal of constraining the set of partitions that humans can represent. And in doing so, to also explain the prevalence of certain partitions, so what makes them more the theory I'm going to focus on here is the kind of classic theory of the person space in terms of binary features. So the two features are plus minus speaker and plus minus hearer. You can see that each one of those 4 person categories is mapped to 2 features in the space. So first person exclusive is plus speaker minus hearer. First person inclusive is plus speaker plus hearer. Second person is minus speaker plus hearer. And third person is minus speaker minus hearer. So it's pretty straightforward explanation here for why these are the particular categories and the only 4 categories that exist as well. Right, so this is a kind of classic theory, as I said. If we ignore for the time being the first person inclusive, because I'm not going to talk about it much in the rest, we can have a think about what this theory might predict in terms of homophony patterns for first, second, and third person. So in particular, you can see that second and third person under this theory share the feature minus speaker. So that leads to the prediction that we might see homophony patterns in which the second and third person are mapped to a single form that's distinct from the first person. So I'll call that second equals third or 2 equals 3 homophony. If we look again, we can see that first person and third person also share a feature here, minus hearer. So that predicts that we might see another homophony pattern where 1 equals 3, and that's distinct from 2. So in other words, what we're seeing here is that under this kind of theory, you predict homophony patterns amongst forms that are similar. And the sense of similarity here is in terms of shared speakers. So second and third person share minus speaker. First and third person share minus hearer. First and second person don't have any features in common. And so the prediction from this theory is that you shouldn't necessarily see homophony patterns in which the first and the second are collapsed. Okay. So we can have a look to see what the typological evidence suggests here. So does this theory, for example, match the typology? And here the typology is actually quite sparse. So this is hard work to do, finding these kinds of homophony patterns and quantifying them. And so for now we have not so many languages. However, amongst these languages, it tends to be the case that 2 equals 3 homophony is fairly common. And then 1 equals 2, and then 1 equals 3. So what you can see here is that the binary features theory doesn't match up all that well with typology. But of course, the typological data are sparse. So here, as elsewhere, what we really need is converging evidence from some other sources other than typology to tell us, is this the right kind of approach to theories of person? And in particular, if people represent the person space in terms of features, then we should see evidence for feature-based similarity in learning. We should see, for example, that some of these homophony patterns are treated differently than others by learners. So to do this, I'm going to show you a set of experiments using artificial language learning. So artificial language learning is a method that's been around for a long time. And in this case, we're going to use it for testing linguistic theories. And what's great about it is that we get data that are straight from learning, but under controlled conditions. So naturally, we could ask, do people who are acquiring these different homophony patterns behave differently? But that tends to get quite complicated. It's hard to compare across languages in that way. So artificial language learning gives us a method for doing that under controlled conditions. Sorry. All right. So I'm going to show you data from a particular type of artificial language learning paradigm. It's one that asks what happens when learners infer what a language might look like given ambiguous input. So in particular, we're going to give them just a part of a system, and then we're going to ask, what do they infer about the rest of the language given just that part of the system? So here in particular, we're going to train them on 3 singular pronoun forms and 2 plural pronoun forms. But one of the forms is going to be held out. So for example, we might teach them first, second, and third singular with 3 distinct forms, and then 2 more forms for first plural and second plural. But we won't ever expose them to third plural meaning. Therefore, they won't ever see a form for the third plural. Then at test, we're going to see what plural form do they use for that held out meaning. So in this case, we'll use English speakers. That's the data I'm going to show you here. And what's good about English speakers from this perspective is that there isn't any vertical homophony pattern in the plural. So in principle, there shouldn't be anything about English that would tell participants what to do. One possibility would be to use the form that they've learned for the second person and extend that, extrapolate that to the third person. Another equally plausible possibility would be for them to use the first person plural form that they learned to express the third person. So that's what we can test there. So that gives us a sense for what happens if we teach participants a distinction between first and second. But we can also design the same setup where instead we teach them a specific form for the first and the third, and we hold out the second. Or we can teach them the second and the third and hold out the first. In each of these cases, we've got two options. So here they can either collapse the second and the third, or the first and the second. Here they can either collapse the first and the third, or the first and the second. So what you see is that by using all these combinations, we can sort of pit each one of these homophony patterns against one another and see what learners prefer. Okay, so you might be wondering already, like, how do you teach people novel pronouns? It's not easy, but we have a wonderful artist who has done some illustrations for us. So we introduce participants to a family called the Smiths. There's a mom and a dad and 3 daughters. And we tell them that it's one of the daughters' birthdays. And as a special gift, her 2 sisters have found her a magic hat. The magic hat is special in that it allows the sister who's wearing it to see the future and answer important questions like who will be fat. I wish I hadn't chosen that example now. But unfortunately, when she talks about the future, she uses a weird ancestral language. And the task of the participants is to try to sort of decode what does this language mean. So during training, participants might see a series of questions like these, and the sister is going to answer them, and you'll see who she's referring to with highlighting. So she might use a word like kip, and you can see that this is highlighting what we can think of as a second person plural. So the addressee there and the little sister. Importantly, the little sister never speaks, she's just kind of hanging around. So the discussion is really always between the 2 older sisters. Makes sense. So that's second person plural. They might also be taught the third person plural form. So that would be like, the little sister and the 2 parents. Okay, but they'll never have seen a form that refers to the first person plural. So they might see that meaning during testing, and then they have to take a guess about which of the 2 forms they've learned they should use to express that. So in the example I just showed you, would they use a llama or kip? All right, so that's what the experiment looks like. And I'm going to show you the results here. And let me just unpack these graphs a little bit for you. So here, what you're seeing is the condition that I just showed you. So participants are going to learn distinct forms for the second and the third. That's the yellow and the purple. But the first person plural is held out. That's the gray. And what I'm plotting here is the proportion of choices that they make between the 2 forms. But here I'm showing you how often they chose the yellow form. That's just arbitrarily chosen. So if people are high on that, you know that they use the yellow form. If they're low, they use the purple form. So here, because they're learning a distinct form for the second and the third, they can either infer first equals third homophony or first equals second homophony. And what you see here is that participants don't particularly like either of these. So they're right at chance. They're not going for one or the other. But in the other 2 conditions, things look a little bit different. So when participants are taught the first person plural and the third person plural, and the second person plural is held out, they have a strong preference to collapse the second person and the third person. That's leaving a distinct form for the first person. And similarly, when they're taught the first person and the second person, with the third person held out, they collapse the second person and the third person. So 2 equals 3 homophony, rather than 1 equals 3 homophony. Okay. So to summarize, we have this kind of feature-based theory that's designed to predict possible or common partitions of this space. The typological data show that 2 = 3 homophony is the most common pattern. And our learning data now also suggests that indeed there's something in particular about 2 = 3 homophony that's most natural for learners. So this supports the general idea that people are using, these kinds of features in order to learn about this space. So not all patterns of homophony are treated the same, but it also suggests that there's something maybe lacking in the particular binary feature-based theory that I showed you here. And actually, there's a more recent theory from Ackerman and Neeleman, 2018, that does a better job actually of capturing this typological and learning-based finding. But interestingly, our results also suggest that there might be an asymmetry between the speaker and the addressee. So what we see in our results is that participants don't really like homophony patterns that involve collapsing the first person with other forms. So we have some ongoing work with that that you can check out that is going to be presented at CogSci this year. Okay, so that's the person system. So I'm going to move on now to a nominal modifier ordering. So here we're going to start from a very old observation from Greenberg, 1963. So Greenberg's work is sort of seminal in the field of linguistic typology. He had a small sample of 30 languages, and he formulated a number of what he called universals that linguists have been following up on ever since. So this one is about noun, phrase, word order. And what it says is that if any or all of demonstrative, numeral, adjective precede the noun, they're in that order. If they follow, it's that order or the opposite. Okay, so let me unpack that for you. So in his sample, he had the languages English, Thai, and Kikuyu. In English, we have the order that is something like those 2 purple chairs. So that's demonstrative, numeral, adjective, noun. In Thai, they have the mirror reverse of that. So chairs, purple to these, or noun, adjective, numeral, demonstrative. In Kikuyu, the order of the modifiers is like in English, but after the noun. So something like chairs, those 2 purple, or noun, demonstrative, numeral, adjective. So you can already see if we actually look at some frequency information that one of those orders is more common than the other. The Thai type order is the most common. Now, if we look at more data, the picture gets a little bit more complicated. So here you can see that of the 24 possible patterns in this space, unlike in the person space, almost all of them are actually attested. So we see very many patterns, but there still seem to be some interesting frequency asymmetries here. So in particular, we see that the English and Thai pattern are the 2 most common, but the Kikuyu pattern is not very common. And that's kind of intriguing. There's actually been a number of very interesting theories that kind of all start from the basis of the idea that there's a kind of common underlying structure that will get you the more common patterns. So here's what that structure looks like. It's one in which adjectives are sort of closest to the noun in the structure, then numerals, then demonstratives. So one way to think about this is in terms of semantic scope or composition. I'm not going to go there quite yet. If you don't like the way these trees look, here's another way of putting it. It's just a way of visualizing what makes the common orders, what these common orders have in common, in fact. So all the blue orders that you see here can be generated by just taking that structure that I showed you and linearizing it. So in all these 8 examples, that's the 8 blue patterns, you can see that the adjective is always closest to the noun, then the numeral, then the adjective. So the idea is that these patterns are more common because they have this underlying structure. Now, the problem with this is that we don't really know just from the typology that this is the actual explanation. So we don't know that participants are sensitive to this kind of underlying structure. But we can again use artificial language learning to ask, are participants actually sensitive to what we think is the underlying structure in this domain? So to do that, we're going to use the same paradigm that I showed you before. It's called the extrapolation paradigm. So recall that we're going to teach people a kind of ambiguous subset of the language, and then we're going to test them on something they've never seen before and see what they do with that. So in this experiment, we're going to train participants on nouns with a single post-nominal modifier. So participants are going to come into the lab. We show them pictures of these kind of simple objects. Here you see that there's a speaker of the language who's pointing at a feather. The feather is sort of farther away from her, a distal feather. And she might say something like "eye hono." And participants should learn across the course of the experiment that "eye" means feather and "hono" means something like that. They also see pictures like this. So "eye taka," where again, "eye" means feather, but here "taka" means red. So in this condition, you're seeing participants learning either a demonstrative and an adjective, but we have other conditions where participants learn a demonstrative and a numeral word, or sometimes they learn an adjective and a numeral word. So we only make them learn 2 types of modifiers at a time just because it's simpler. And then the question is, how are they going to order 2 modifiers? So if they see a picture like this, where instead of just a plain red feather or a feather that's distal but not colored, they're seeing a colored distal feather. So they need to use both the demonstrative and the adjective in order to describe this picture. One possibility is that they could use noun, demonstrative, adjective. The other possibility is that they could use noun, adjective, demonstrative. Okay, so if they are sensitive to this underlying structure, then they should use that underlying structure to infer the surface order of the language. We call this the homomorphic pattern because this pattern transparently reflects that underlying structure. By contrast, an order like noun, demonstrative, adjective can't be derived on the basis of that structure. So it doesn't have this nice nested representation here. On the other hand, what I'm going to show you first here is data from English speakers. Now, in principle, one might imagine that noun, demonstrative, adjective is quite good for English speakers because it maintains the linear order of modifiers in English. So this is an interesting population to test. Okay, so here are the results from this experiment. So are speakers sensitive to underlying representation? Yes, they are. So what you're seeing here is how often do they choose the homomorphic order? And no matter what combination of modifiers they see, participants are highly likely to choose that order. So they use the order that transparently reflects that hypothesized underlying structure. But again, these are English speakers. So I mentioned that it's nice that these speakers have to choose a pattern that doesn't use the surface modifier order of their language. But on the other hand, English is a homomorphic language. So English has this kind of feature of reflecting transparently the underlying structure in this domain. And so one might imagine that that's sort of what prompts them to do what they do. This theory that we're testing here actually makes the prediction that even if speakers don't have a homomorphic language, even if their language is non-homomorphic, they still ought to have the same preferences. So to do that, we're currently testing speakers of a language called Kitaraka. So Kitaraka is like Kikuyu from Greenberg's original sample. So it has the order noun, demonstrative, numeral, adjective. So that's a non-homomorphic order. So that makes this population a good one to test to see whether, in fact, this sensitivity to homomorphism is actually something we find regardless of participants' native language. Now, our data collection was well underway, and then the pandemic hit. So sadly, I'm not going to be able to show you data from this experiment now, but watch this space. Hopefully, we will finish our data collection once everything has calmed back down. In the meantime, I'm going to show you some data from a different kind of artificial language paradigm, namely the sign of gesture paradigm. So this is a method for testing hypotheses about how people improvise in a new modality that's distinct from their own. Why might we want to do this? Well, previous research has shown that doing this kind of experiment where you take, for example, non-signing participants and you ask them to improvise gestures in the manual modality, it turns out that they don't just recapitulate the features of their language, like word order, for example. Rather, regardless of their native language, you can see interesting commonalities amongst their gestures. So we're going to use this paradigm in this domain. What we do is bring people into the lab, and we put them at a table. In front of them are two iPads. So one of the iPads is close, one is far away. So that will give them a kind of information that's similar to what one might convey using demonstratives like this and that. On each trial, a picture appears on one of those iPads. The pictures are simple things like toothbrushes and pencils. They might be striped or spotted, and there's either 4 of them or 5 of them. So I'll give you an example of a gesture that a participant produces in this experiment. Show one more time. So you can see she's first indicating which iPad it's on. Then it's a toothbrush, stripes. There's 4 of them. I can show you one more. So here you have pencils, spotted for this iPad here. Okay, so if you were looking very closely, you might have noticed that those were 2 different orders. Neither of them was the order of English, but they were both homomorphic. So here I'm showing you 2 different ways of visualizing this data. So in the first, you're seeing each participant's preferred order. So what's the order that they use most frequently? So we take that order for each participant, and here I'm showing you how many participants have each of those orders as their preferred one. The blue ones are homomorphic, the gray ones are not homomorphic. So you can see that the vast majority of participants used a preferred order that was homomorphic. The second graph is just showing you across all the gestures that anyone produced, how many of them were homomorphic versus not. And again, you can see that the vast majority of gestures we got in this experiment were indeed homomorphic. It's worth noting again that the most common preferred order we see is not like straightforwardly the order of English noun phrases. Right. So indeed, here we see that improvised gestures reflect this preference for homomorphic ordering of information. I'm saying ordering of information conveyed by these elements because this is not syntax. You know, these are just people improvising gestures. So this already gives you a sense that maybe this is not something that's purely about syntax. Maybe it's reflecting something a little bit deeper, and that's what I'm going to go after next. Just to summarize where we're at so far. So we have a theory which suggests this hypothesized underlying representation for elements in the noun phrase. This structure is such that adjectives come closest to the noun, then numerals, then demonstratives. The idea is that if you take this structure and you linearize it, you get 8 potential orders for free from that structure, and those happen to be quite common in the typology. So that's promising in terms of the theory. On the other hand, almost all orders are actually attested by now. And so we really need some evidence that, that connects these 2 together. So the learning data provide exactly this kind of link. So they show us that learners are in fact sensitive to homomorphism. So they prefer orders that are homomorphic. So that offers a potential mechanism for why the typology looks the way it does. But what exactly is this representation, right? So where does it come from? Is it about syntax? Is it about something else? So I've suggested just a moment ago that it's something to do with meaning. And indeed, historically, these theories have typically taken this to be something like semantic scope or composition order. But I want to take it back a little bit deeper than that. So I'm going to start by giving you an intuition. So if you think about objects that you might see in the world, common objects, it's very easy to come up with examples where that object is very closely associated with the kind of properties that we convey using adjectives. So for example, bananas are closely associated with their color. So are other kinds of fruit like apples. So is something like wine. There are other objects out in the world that are very, very closely associated with things like the material that they're made out of or their texture. It's easy to come up with these kinds of examples, it's no problem. Now consider whether you can equally well come up with examples in which an object is very closely associated with its numerosity. So it's possible to do. So, some things come in pairs. Maybe some things come in like very high numerosities like sand or very low numerosities like keys. That's not nearly as easy to sort of come up with those examples as it is for things that we convey using adjectives. What about the kind of information we convey using demonstratives? So like location relative to the speaker. So could you come up with examples of objects in the world that are closely associated with those things? Well, not really. Sort of by their nature, they aren't very closely tied to particular objects. So the intuition is that objects and their properties are very closely associated with one another. So adjectives, things that we convey using adjectives. Objects and their numerosities, kind of, they're you can find some examples, but there's not a very close association. Now, objects and their discourse status, yet a weaker association with objects and discourse status. So the idea is that that kind of information is out there in the world, and it could be used to build a structure that looks a lot like the one that we've seen so far. So that's an intuition, and we can think about how we might be able to quantify that intuition. So namely, the idea that this underlying structure in this domain actually reflects differences in conceptual closeness. So it happens to be that there's a good quantitative measure of strength of association. It's called point-wise mutual information. So I'm showing you an equation, which is a very simple one. So in the numerator, that's just the frequency of two elements, x and y together. How often do I see those two together? And the denominator is the frequency of those elements alone. So what is just the raw frequency of x and y? So those two things together give us a sense for whether the co-occurrence frequency of x and y is higher than expected given the individual frequencies of those elements alone. So a quantitative measure of the strength of association, point-wise mutual information. So our prediction is that the point-wise mutual information of objects and their properties should be very high, higher than the point-wise mutual information of objects and their numerosities, which is in turn higher than PMI of objects and discourse status. How might we test this? Well, the best way to do it would be a corpus of tagged visual scenes. So the way I've explained this so far is with reference to objects out there in the world. So that's what we would ideally want. Unfortunately, we don't have such a corpus. So instead, we use tree bank corpora for 25 different languages. So tree bank corpora, like the ones we use, are dependency parsed. So that means we can actually get a sense for which modifiers are tied to which nouns, for example. How does this work? So what we do is we get all noun modifier bigrams and their frequencies. So that includes adjectives, numerals, and demonstratives. We discard the very low frequency pairs because they're known to mess with PMI. Then we calculate PMI for each pair and average that across modifier types. So here's the results of that analysis for the English tree bank data and also for dependency parsed childist corpora. So childist is data that includes child-directed speech. So this is all of English childist, for example. And you can see that for each of these cases, PMI between adjectives and nouns is the highest. PMI between nouns and numerals is the next highest, and the PMI between nouns and demonstratives is low. So that's exactly what we would predict. And we can check this, as I said, across lots of different languages to make sure that there's nothing about the particular languages that somehow influences this calculation. And what you can see is that for each one of these languages, we see this same pattern: highest PMI for nouns and adjectives, lowest PMI for nouns and demonstratives. Okay, so to summarize, the idea is that we've got this hypothesized underlying representation. There's supposed to be a tree here. What we saw before was that orders that are homomorphic to this are more common. And we saw some learning data that indeed suggested there's something special about these homomorphic patterns. And the last part here, I've tried to show you that the underlying structure actually reflects conceptual knowledge that can be learned from observing the world. So imagine I have my tree here. The idea is that this kind of information is available for learners. Once they sort of track the statistics of objects in the world around them, they can use that to build exactly the kind of representation that syntacticians have typically proposed underlies the noun phrase. Right. Okay, so here we were talking about the order of elements in the noun phrase that are independent words. But we can also ask, well, what about ordering of other elements? So what about, for example, little morphemes rather than words? Now, this brings us to the last thing I want to talk about today, which is morpheme ordering. So how are morphemes generally linearized in languages? So you can see in English some interesting patterns. So for example, take the words neighborhoods, readers, organizes. So all of these words are made up of at least 3 different parts: a stem and 2 morphemes. In each case, one of the morphemes is a derivational morpheme, and one of the morphemes is an inflectional morpheme. And it happens to be that in English, you systematically get derivational morphemes inside of inflectional morphemes. So you can draw the same kind of sort of structure that we saw in the noun phrase here, where you've got a noun stem that attaches first with the derivational morpheme, and then the inflectional morpheme attaches on top of that. And again, we can use the same kind of schematic representation to show what that looks like. So that's just one example, but there's generally been kind of 2 ideas about why we might get an order that looks like this. So one is based on this kind of structural representation I've showed you already before. So the idea is that this is driven mainly by meaning. So affixes that more directly affect the meaning compose with the stem first. That's kind of related to the idea I talked about before, that things that are kind of conceptually close to one another might appear closer to one another. But there's another idea out there, namely that it's frequency that determines how morphemes are ordered relative to one another. So in particular, the idea is that affixes that co-occur more with the stem come closer. Or another way to think about it is that if you get a morpheme that's kind of more promiscuous, it attaches to lots of different forms, then that meaning is less closely associated with the noun itself. And so it's going to be sort of more independent of the stem, and therefore it should come outside other morphemes that are more frequently associated with that stem. So those are kind of 2 different ways of thinking about it. And it's certainly not the case that only one could come into play. But we're going to, in particular, look into the role of meaning in how morphemes are ordered in the noun phrase. So we're not going to be looking at inflectional and derivational morphology. Instead, we're going to be looking at another pattern that was noticed by Greenberg back in the 60s. Namely that if you look at languages that have independent markers for number and case, so independent morphemes for both those types of meanings, what you see is that number marking always comes closer to the stem than case. And again, we can sort of consider these 2 hypotheses. So does it have to do with meaning, or does it have to do with frequency? And the idea here behind the meaning hypothesis would be, again, that affixes that more directly affect the meaning compose the stem first. So you can imagine, for example, that we kind of want to pluralize the noun first, and then we can use the case marker to sort of indicate how that noun is playing a role in the larger structure of the sentence. So that's one possibility. Or it could just be that, you know, this is driven by something more like frequency. Maybe nouns occur more often with plural markers than accusative markers. It could be that some of these tend to be null affixes. So we're going to look into that using an artificial language learning experiment again. So same paradigm as we used before. So here is going to look very similar to the experiment that I showed you for noun phrase word order. We're going to train participants on nouns with a single post-nominal morpheme. And then at test, we're going to ask how do they order those two morphemes, even though they've never seen that. So here we show people sort of simple pictures of actions. So here you might see a picture of a single cowboy poking or pointing to a single burglar. And what you see here, or what you would learn if you're a participant in the experiment across trials, is that the accusative singular is marked with the morpheme T. Now you might see another example where there's a plural subject and a singular object. And here you might learn that the plural is marked with a saw. So you will learn both that there's a suffix for an accusative and a suffix for a plural. But you would never see during training a picture like this where there's actually a singular subject and a plural object. So here you would need to use both your accusative morpheme and your plural morpheme. And again, participants could do this one of two ways. So they could produce the ordered noun accusative marker plural marker, or noun plural marker accusative marker. And again, it's the second one that kind of reflects what we would expect if participants are using the meaning of these elements to drive what the order should be. In this experiment, we make sure that there is no frequency difference between either how often these individual morphemes occur, nor how often they are paired with a noun. So there's nothing in the frequency information that could tell them how they should order these elements. There's only something about the meaning of the two elements. Okay, so the first data I'm going to show you is with English speakers. So note that English has a plural morpheme, but it has no case marker. Here you can see that people almost always choose the homomorphic order. And we sometimes give participants prefixes, we sometimes give them suffixes. I was showing you the suffix condition in the previous slide, but it doesn't matter. In any case, they always order the number marker closer to the noun stem than case. We also run this experiment with Japanese speakers. So Japanese has case marking, but no number marking. And it doesn't make a difference. So here you see Japanese speakers also uniformly choosing the homomorphic order. We also wondered what would happen if we chose two morphemes that English speakers are not familiar with. As you can see, we were just a little bit worried that there was something about people's familiarity with these elements that might cause them to order them one way or another. So we tried teaching participants a language that has a nominative marker rather than an accusative marker, and a singulative marker. So that is a marker that's, that marks singulars rather than plurals. So that's not something that English speakers have experience with. So here's an example of a trial here. So they would learn that saw is a nominative marker and T is a singulative marker. Again, but they would never see a picture that requires using both the nominative and the singulative marker together. And again, we see the same results as before. So a strong preference for participants to order the singulative marker closer to the noun stem than the nominative marker. One last experiment where we asked what happens if we actually include a competing locality constraint. So here we are interested to see whether we could get people sort of away from their homomorphism preference if there was a dependency between the noun and the case marker. So in particular, we use noun conditioned case allomorphy. So we have two bisyllabic noun stems and they take a case marker saw, and we have two monosyllabic stems that take a different case marker gu. So that creates a dependency between the noun and the case marker. And in that case, you can see that actually some participants go with the non-homomorphic pattern. So in other words, they put the dependent elements, the noun and the case marker, closer together. And that overrides a bit the preference for homomorphism. Okay, so to summarize here, again, we have this sort of underlying theory that meaning is, at least in part, what drives morpheme order. So noun and number sort of compose with one another first, and case gets added on next. That's supported by the typology, where we see languages almost uniformly ordering number markers closer than case markers to the noun. And this is supported now by this learning data. So again, the idea is that the learning data provide a mechanism for linking this underlying structure to the typology. Now, interestingly, in this case, this kind of meaning-based information seems to totally override frequency information, but it interacts in an interesting way with the preference to keep dependent elements close. Okay, so I've given you 3 examples here where representations of meaning play a crucial role in shaping typology. So first, in person systems, where we saw that common homophony patterns seem to be based on similarity among meanings that can be determined by based on theories of primitive features. So we had a theory there that was supported in a kind of mixed way by typology and learning results, which has some interesting implications for what theories of person should look like. A second example was nominal modifier ordering. So there we saw that common orders seem to be based on a kind of transparent mapping from a meaning-based structure to linear order. And I argued that the meaning-based structure was something that was potentially learnable from interacting with objects in the world. And there was evidence from the theory which posited this underlying structure, typology which supported the notion that that underlying structure might be shaping why language looks the way it does, and then some experimental evidence both from artificial language learning and silent gesture, accompanied by some quantitative corpus results supporting the idea that the structure is meaning-based. And for morpheme order, it was kind of the same again. So there we saw that there's a role for meaning and our representations of meaning in driving particular patterns of morpheme order. This was driven by predictions of a particular theory, supported up by typology and now by novel artificial language learning results. Right, so just to zoom back up to our big picture, so in this talk and in my work in general, I'm interested in understanding why languages look the way they do. And there's a kind of complex set of features that we know shape languages. So, if we see a given typological universal, we might want to build a theory of which of these features plays a role in driving that. And what I've tried to show you here is that typology is a nice start. Theory is a very necessary part, but experimental and quantitative evidence can also really help us to adjudicate among competing hypotheses, which in our field are sometimes quite contentious. Okay, thanks. Thank you very much. And thanks to my many collaborators on this work. I'm very much looking forward to hearing what you think about it.
Thank you, Jennifer. We have time for 1 or 2 questions. So if you have a question, just go ahead and indicate in the chat window. We'll take our first question from Lilia Risman.
Hello, can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Hi, Jenny. How's it going? Good to see you.
Hi, nice to see you too.
Yeah. I had a question about the second part of your work. So particularly about the association between objects and properties versus objects and numerosity. So that makes a lot of sense intuitively, and you have strong empirical evidence for it from the corpus work that you've done. It's clearly that asymmetry is available for children to be learned in the language input. I was less clear about why that is something that is available in the world to be observed. So if you did that visual, looking at scenes and detecting structures in the scenes, like every time you see an object, there would be a numerosity associated with that object in the visual scene. It just seems like we as language users care less about the numerosity for whatever reason when we create our nominal meanings. So it was less clear to me about why that, the tighter association between the property and the object, why is that something that's part of the world rather than part of like our conceptual priorities in our language?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, as you pointed out, the data that I'm showing you are from a corpus. And so, I did a little bit of a bait and switch there. On the other hand, I think, so the example that you gave is that every time we see an object, we will also see its numerosity. And that is definitely true. But actually, the relevant question is whether that numerosity will always be the same or will be similar enough that we will create a strong association between that object and its numerosity, right? So for example, every time we see a banana, it's like either going to be green or yellow or brown, right? Mostly yellow. But every time we see a banana, is there one of them or two of them or five of them?
Okay, I see what you're saying. So there's more
so
likely
we always have access. We always have access to the information about, how many are there? What does it look like? Where is it relative to the speaker? The question is whether there's a tight association between that information. And my argument is yes for yellow, but no for the number of bananas.
I see what you're saying. So yeah, there's more variability in the numerosity just because of how we interact with objects. Okay.
Yes, that's the claim. And it's not necessarily the case that that's not sort of further influenced by our own priorities. So I think that could be true. And it would be very interesting to see, in fact, are there differences between what we might see in a tagged corpus and a tagged corpus of visual scenes? That remains to be seen.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Cool. Thank you.
We'll take our next question from Jeffrey Litz.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. Anyway, great talk. I have a question similar to Lilia's. I'm just wondering about why the tree bank statistic indicates that conceptual knowledge is learned. So like I could imagine an alternative, which is that the conceptual knowledge is an explanation for why the point-wise mutual information patterns as it does, and that learners could use that statistic as evidence for the semantic class of the adjectives. So why would you think it goes your way and not the other way? Like why does the learning have to be, you learn the concept and that explains something about the linguistic distribution, as opposed to the concept and that you use that conceptual knowledge to explain, to acquire the linguistic facts.
Right. Yeah. I mean, so just to be clear, so my argument is that you notice what objects in the world are like and how they're associated with things, right? And you use that to build a kind of conceptual structure. That conceptual structure is probably reflected in language, outside of noun phrase word order, but it helps to construct an underlying syntactic structure that's then going to be linearized. So you are asking, why isn't it the case that, what's the direction you want it to go in?
Well, so what I'm wondering is, like, why does that conceptual information, of course, the facts of the distribution of objects are the way that they are, right? And the question is that conceptual knowledge acquired by observing those distributions, or is that conceptual knowledge just the way it is because humans are the way they are, right? And then, right, the language learner can use the distribution of adjectives and nouns and number words and nouns in order to determine the semantic class of those things, which are then going to be reflective of the conceptual knowledge. So I'm not denying that the conceptual knowledge feeds the syntactic representation. I'm just wondering which way the learning goes.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a fair question. I guess my hope was to sort of take that responsibility off the language learner in a way. I mean, I do think it interacts with knowledge of categories, for sure, because, for example, you don't see languages determining their order purely on the basis of something like the individual PMI of a noun and a particular adjective. So it's very clear to me that there's interaction between what's going on here and the syntactic categories. But my argument here, without very much evidence so far, is that one could, in principle, learn that information from the world around us and not have to get it from linguistic system alone.
Okay. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have. So I'm going to cut it off here, and we can pick this back up in the general discussion period.